Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. The Killer Women vodcast is pleased to be a part of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. To learn more about Danielle and her books, visit her at www.daniellegirard.com, and to access all of our vodcasts, go to youtube.com/Authors on the Air. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network. I am your host, Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Clare Mackintosh. With more than 2 million copies of her book sold worldwide, #1 international bestseller, Clare Mackintosh is the multi-award-winning author of I Let You Go, which was a New York Times bestseller, as well as I See You and Let Me Lie. Her most recent thriller, Hostage, was a USA Today bestseller and the Barnes & Noble, our monthly mystery and thriller pick for March of 2022. Her new detective mystery, The Last Party, will be available in the United States on November 8th. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you. What an introduction. Thanks for that.
I know I fumble over all the words. When I have to read, I can think faster than I can read it, clearly. So tell our listeners, which I gobbled this book up, tell our listeners about The Last Party.
It is a detective murder mystery in the vein of a sort of a classic murder mystery. So a kind of Agatha Christie style setup. It takes place on the border between England and Wales, around a lake through which the border runs. So on the Welsh side of the lake is, the lake is called Llyn or Mirror Lake. On the Welsh side of the lake is a small rural community, which is also where our detective comes from. And on the English side of the lake is a luxury resort of log cabins, decks stretching out over the water, full of very rich people behaving atrociously. There's lots of tension between the two sides, as there often is near a border. And on New Year's Eve, there's a big party at the luxury holiday resort, kind of designed to build bridges between the two communities, but somebody ends up dead. And so on New Year's Day, at the start of the book, we join the story when the locals from this Welsh village are going into the lake for their annual New Year's Day swim, and a body floats through the mist from the English side of the lake to the Welsh side.
And from there, it is just every single person you meet is a viable suspect for this murder, which is so fun. Like you said, it's Agatha Christie sort of on like steroids. So it sounds like the inspiration for this book was a little bit personal, right? You moved your family to Wales. Tell our listeners a little bit about sort of where the idea came from, because it's so fabulous and vibrant, and the lake is such a real place. Talk to us about that.
So this felt very different to my other books. So all my standalone thrillers have started with a concept. So they've started with, a type of crime, or they've started with, so with Hostage, for example, what would happen if you were on a 20-hour long haul flight and something horrific happened. And this was very different. This started on New Year's Day, when I was standing by the lake in our small rural Welsh community, which is surrounded by mountains, and I was standing there looking at the mist floating on the surface of the water, and everyone was shouting Happy New Year, and everyone was saying how incredible this moment was. And I was thinking, what if a body floated through the water? Because that's what we do, right?
Of course, yeah.
We're walking through beautiful woods and everyone's loving the leaves crunching underfoot, and we're thinking, what if I buried a body? Like, how long before it was discovered or it decomposed?
Right.
So I was doing that crime writer thing, and I went home and I was kind of thinking just about a setting, and I've never had a book start with a setting before. So I was mulling over, well, where has this body come from? Who is the body? It's come from the other side of the lake. And this was January 2020. And of course, very shortly after that, the pandemic just changed everything. And borders became incredibly important. And in the UK, so I live fairly close to the border with England. And in the UK, of course, we operate mostly as one nation, but we are, distinct countries within that. And so suddenly this border between England and Wales became really important because we have devolved authority in health. And so Wales had different rules, different laws to England. If they were in lockdown in England, we might not have been in lockdown in Wales, or vice versa. You couldn't cross the border. You needed, authority. So it was very, very different for us.
Right.
We're not used to having that type of border that you could previously just kind of, cross when you want. And I wanted to explore that and also explore some of the tensions that I've experienced as an English person moving into Wales. My children are bilingual Welsh English. They're educated in the Welsh language. I'm a Welsh learner. So there's a lot going on that I wanted to explore. And because I write crime fiction, and I think there is no better genre for exploring society, I chose to put this in a crime novel.
And it's not just the border between the two countries and the languages and the sort of, the English, feeling a little bit superior to the Welsh, but also the border between wealth, right? The border of the uber wealthy to those people, sort of the working class. And that is such a prominent, it's obviously so prominent in our world right now, but it's such a wonderful theme that you explore in your book. And I have really been on like a Clare Mackintosh. I have been splurging all of the Clare Mackintosh books all in a row, because I was like, because of course I've had this book I Let You Go. For those of us who aren't watching me, with these beautiful covers. And I was like, now that I'm into Clare, I got to read all the Clares. So I read these all three almost back to back, and I haven't gotten the other two. I have to take a little breather. I don't want to spoil all my Clares all at once, but it's amazing. I mean, these books are all so different. So let's talk about that, because I mean, each one of them, like you said, the real theme amongst them all is sort of this: your detective. There's always a strong detective character. So talk about your own background, right? Because that's the world you come from. But like you said, the books, each one is such a unique story that and I think one of the themes that follows through all of them, besides detective, is motherhood. So let's talk about first, if you will, your sort of background as a police officer, and how that sort of is how you transitioned into writing, and how that sort of oh my God, my brain's still not working. How that sort of, affects the way you write these stories.
Yeah, I think it has a huge influence on my writing, but not in the way that people think. So when I tell people that I was a police officer for 12 years, I think there is an assumption that I have, like a bank of cases, and when I want to write a new book, I just sort of flip through this mental Rolodex of cases, and I go, oh, I know, I'll fictionalize that one. And it's really not like that. And it's not like that because actually most real life cases aren't that interesting. Most of them are fairly run of the mill. Most criminals are not the mustache twirling, master criminals that we like to read or watch on TV. They're pretty stupid. That's why they get caught, fortunately. But what being in the police force taught me was so much about human nature, about the human condition, about why we do the things that we do, and how we behave once we've done them or once they've been done to us. So it is a fascinating insight, sort of beneath the bonnet, the hood, beneath the hood.
Right, we have to translate. Yes.
Yeah. And so, I just sort of give you an example of something that changed the way I policed, and I think then also changed the way I write. So I was a very young police officer, and I met a girl the same age as me who was living on the street. So she was a heroin addict, and we had both gone to college, at the same time, and we'd both studied French. So we had this sort of very similar background. And then halfway through our degrees, her father had died, and she had sort of plummeted into this this awful state of grief. She didn't have the support that she needed, and everything started to go wrong, and she started taking drugs. And here we were 2-3 years after that moment, and I was a police officer and she was homeless and a drug addict. And actually all that had happened was that her father had died.
Right.
And it was such a simple lesson in teaching me that life is really fragile, and that any one of us could end up in a situation, that girl hadn't gone, she hadn't set out in life to commit crimes, to take drugs, to get into
Right.
fights. It was circumstance that had led her to that. And so every time I spoke to anyone then, whatever their background, whatever their sort of status, I just always had that in mind, that we're all essentially the same underneath, and that any of us could find ourselves in a position where we might commit a crime or be victim of a crime.
Right.
My writing now, I think one of the common threads that runs through my books is that question of what makes ordinary people do terrible things.
Right.
And that pretty much crops up in every book, I think.
It does, and in beautiful ways. I mean, I think about the hostage, which is a woman who gets on an airplane for 20 hours, no Wi-Fi, and then her daughter is threatened, and you think about what you would do to save your child, and absolutely, and then every behavior after that, including the bad guys in all these books. It's like you can see a little bit how these things happen, right? I mean, it's like, there is no person in any of the books who's completely evil or completely innocent, right? Including sort of the people that we root for. And the thing I just was floored by, and I want to ask about this, I mentioned it before we started, is that they're literally, almost without fail, every single person in this book had a reason, and a good reason, to want the victim dead. And so what I was, when I was thinking about how you pulled this off, because Agatha Christie often has a closed room mystery, and there's maybe a dozen people. You have a cast of, I mean, it seems like there's like 30 people in this book who all could possibly want this gentleman dead. So tell us, as a process wise, because I'm of course dying to understand it, literally. How do you do this? Is it a map? How are you figuring out each one of these characters? Because they're beautifully drawn people. We're not 30 people. I mean, it's not 30. Do you know how many people are in, like, how many points of view?
No, I haven't, but I swear every time I write a book, I say to myself, okay, keep it small, and it just grows and grows and grows. It's a big cast, and I work really hard in trying to make those voices as distinct as possible, and there are particular ways that I do that, that are different with each book. Sometimes I will write in the first person directly to the reader, which is a really good way of instantly getting someone's voice. And if you get their voice, then you know who they are, and you're not going to confuse them with someone else. It's much harder to do that, I think, if you're writing in third person, for example, because the reader's doing more work to position that character. So yeah, it is tricky. I plot and I plan my books like I am investigating a murder. It is spreadsheets, it's whiteboards, it's flow charts, it's pictures, it's post-it notes, it's everything everywhere. And I don't write until I've got the whole thing nailed down. That doesn't mean it doesn't change. It doesn't mean that I don't have to throw it away and start again. But I planned the whole thing. And with a book like Hostage, for example, which took place on an aeroplane, so I had to know where everyone was sitting, and when they moved around, so I had a big cross section, big seating plan of a Boeing 777. I had to know what time zone they were in. So when they look out of the window, is it light, is it dark, are they over sea or land? You know, those sorts of things were tricky. The Last Party is slightly more straightforward in terms of timeline, except that the first half of the book, some of the action goes backwards and then we go forwards again, and we see those scenes mirrored back on each other, but with a slightly different perspective. So there's always a structural challenge that makes it interesting to write.
I mean, and talk about that mirroring, because that's super interesting, right? So we see we see the perspective, we see somebody, a lot of the book happens on New Year's Eve, right? Because that's when the victim dies. And so you have these scenes where you see New Year's Eve from one perspective, and then later in the book you see it from a different perspective, which changes, of course, the way we see it. And because you're doing this so beautifully, it's really just the character perspective that shifts, right? I mean, the events that happen are exactly the same as you would expect.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you think of something like The Affair, did you watch The Affair on TV? They have these incredible scenes. So you would see the same scene, for example, from a husband's viewpoint and a wife's viewpoint. And as the viewer, you were essentially watching two different scenes, and yet it was the same scene. So it's that sort of concept. And it was inspired by something called palindromic poetry. So palindrome being a word that you can read from either front or back. And palindromic poetry is, you'll have seen examples online. There are some incredible ones about immigration and self-esteem, all sorts. So you read them from the first line to the last line and they have one meaning, but then you read the last line and then you read up and they have a completely different meaning. Incredible. And they're really cleverly written. And I wanted I was thinking a lot about the lake and about mirroring. The lake is called Mirror Lake. And as you say, these sort of two sides, these borders in terms of haves and have-nots and culture and languages. And the two detectives, because it's a cross-border investigation. So we have one English detective, one Welsh detective. And the idea of a palindrome really seemed to fit with the story, that you would see it, you know, one version one way and then in a different way. And so the structure of the book sort of does that in that the first half of the book goes from New Year's Eve, when the party takes place, and then works backwards through time to the midpoint of the book, which is when this holiday resort opened. So we're kind of at the beginning of the story then, and that's when it starts to move forward. And yes, it's the same. I mean, it sounds like it should be repetitive. It's not repetitive, because what we're seeing is almost, I suppose, we're referring to the same actions that took place, but because we're in someone else's head and we're getting their backstory and their bias and their, you know, take on everything, it is completely different. And we realize that all those assumptions we made in the first half actually are very different.
It's so clever. Exactly. I mean, I think they don't feel like the same scenes at all. Although you're right, they're, you know, planted in several sort of key lines that you recognize from somebody else's point of view, and yet they're often twisted 180, because when you see it from somebody else's point of view, it's a scene that's can be the opposite of what we saw originally, and that is amazing. So you mentioned that and there's a question and answers, which I love at the back of the book. I always read that that you feel like plotting a book is like solving a murder in reverse. So when you start the book, do you know who did it? Is that how you?
Yeah, I do. But it often, if not always, changes. So I start off and I know how it's done. And so the first thing that happened with this particular book, with The Last Party, was that I knew how the murder had happened. And it was a fun, I mean, you know, fun in any way that murder is fun. It was an interesting way of killing someone that I really wanted to use. I was quite excited when I came up with this murder method. Googled a lot to see if it had been done in real life or in fiction, couldn't find it, thought I have actually invented a way of killing someone
It's very
and
clever.
destroying the evidence
Yes.
that means I could get away with it. So that was my starting point. I knew I wanted multiple suspects, and that's partly because it was just that sort of book that, you know, as a party, there's lots of people that might have wanted to have done this, but also because crime fiction readers are really clever, aren't they? I mean, they just
are
better and better and better, all these armchair detectives. And you need to, you know, we have to make them work. The whole thing is a game, isn't it? So in the book, in any of our crime books, it's a game of cat and mouse between the baddie and the detectives, or, you know, the protagonists. But it's also a game of cat and mouse between us and the reader. And
absolutely.
it's all about the timing of information that we're going to allow the reader to get. And what I love is if the reader comes to the right conclusion just a split second before it's revealed. That's perfection for me. You know, I want them to feel like they are brilliant, but only for a second before, you know, I would have told you anyway.
Right. Well, I would say I would very much challenge the reader to guess the end of this book. I mean, that is, and as you say, we are savvy. I mean, as writers as well as readers, we have seen pretty much, you know, everything done. But as you said, the cat and mouse game you play here is phenomenal. And I'm curious because I know you mentioned in you know, that the whodunit had changed in the second draft. So that's interesting too. You get to the end of the first draft and you're like, this doesn't work, or is it like, oh, I have a better way? What sort of happens?
I mean, all sorts of things happen with different books. I think with this particular book, with The Last Party, the motivation just wasn't quite strong enough. With the original suspect, and in the course of having written it, a much better suspect had kind of evolved. And that's the other nice thing about writing a book with lots of suspects, is it's actually, you don't have to go back and, you know, change the whole story or create a motivation. They do genuinely would all quite like him dead. It's just whether they've got the, you know, the means and the drive and, you know, the opportunity. So I think that's why this one changed. Sometimes it just doesn't work at all. In I See You, the character had sort of evolved in such a way that that the original suspect was just a bit too pathetic to murder someone. They just didn't have it in them, and so I had to go back to the drawing board. But I always know, or think I know at the start, who's done it.
So in your process of writing, you know, you do this, you know, very specific, very careful plotting, you know, like you said, flow charts and post-it notes and whiteboards, and then you write the draft and sort of see, you know, from that point where things might evolve.
Yeah, and then I throw it away. And then I throw it away and start again. Yeah, which is
insane.
Oh, it's awful. It's awful. It is utterly insane. I'm not happy about it. This is not, you know, I don't want this to be my process, but it has been my process for every book so far. And I'm on a bit of a mission to change this because it's really inefficient. I basically write 2 books a year, but only one of them is published. And that is what I've done for the last sort of 8 years, which is ridiculous, because if you're going to write 2 books a year, you know, at least get paid for them, right?
It's true.
But what happens? So for example, with book 2 in this series, because I will talk about this, I'm sure, but The Last Party is the start of a series. So I'm writing book 2, and after I wrote the first draft of it, I just came up with a really, really brilliant idea for an impossible murder, like a murder that that just, or an impossible suspect, like he you know, that this person just could not have done it, and yet they did. And once I had that idea, I couldn't ignore it. And it's not like I
Right.
could save it for another book.
You
because
couldn't save it? It
specifically-
couldn't be book 3?
No, because it specifically relates to the
Right, right.
circumstances of this particular book. And because it was so significant, it involved a completely new book. It wasn't a question of just changing the murder or changing the ending, or it was a different approach to the same story. And the only option was to throw it away and start again. And it's, you know, it's demoralizing, but I can't ignore a much better idea. And so far in my writing career, I haven't managed to have that brilliant idea at the beginning. I've only ever had it at the end.
Well, so you know, I talked to Jillian McAllister about this, and she's the same. I don't know if you guys have discussed your this proclivity, because it's I mean, it's extremely unusual. Do you then, are you basically saying that you finish the last party and you think, okay, some of this worked, some of it didn't, and you just start again with a blank screen? You're not working with parts of the book?
No, I mean, I don't, you know, I do keep it. It is there, and there will be it's very unusual that the first chapter would change. So generally the first chapter pretty much stays word for word how it was when I first thought of, you know, when I first started the book. But yeah, every draft will be a fresh document. And to be honest, I will do that even when I get, say, to the third draft, where I'm maybe just doing, I don't know, character edits, or I'll start a blank document. And I might, at that point, then I might copy and, well, I will be copying and pasting large amounts across. Whereas at the beginning, I'm writing from scratch, and very occasionally I'll get to a point where I think, oh, this is pretty much the same scene that I had, and then what I'll have is the original document on the left of my screen and the new document on the right, and I'll kind of refer back to it.
Mm-hmm. But you still write it, yeah.
Yeah, I still write it, because writing it out creates much better work for me than trying to edit something that's already there. You know,
I agree
I
with
find
that, yeah.
it's a very different example, but it's the same principle, that if someone were to ask me to write something, you know, like I don't know, a wedding speech, for example, I would find it much easier to write it from scratch than to try and edit someone else's work, you know, to sort of get the flow. And to get that flow, I need that blank page. I need to be able to just create it. There's also, because I make such extensive changes, there's a high risk that if I worked from an original document, I'd leave what I call orphans throughout the book, you know, things that related to a different character or an old plot line, seeds that don't need to be planted now because I'm not going to harvest them in this particular book. So it is just cleaner and safer to start from scratch.
So I mean, so Claire, are you writing, you know, 7 days a week, 10 hours a day? How are you doing this?
I mean, yeah, at the moment, yeah, I write, I am writing 7 days a week because I'm really behind, and I'm really behind because I keep throwing books away. So this is why I would quite like to solve my process problem. I've sort of changed my working hours a bit recently. So my husband, 6 years ago, my husband left work, and for the last 6 years, he's been kind of just the constant at home. So
Yeah,
he's out with the kids, the domestic stuff, like anything that needed doing, which meant I could just work as much as I needed / wanted to. And that would be generally at my desk from about 9, and then staying here till sort of 7 in the evening, something like that. But 2 weeks ago, he went back to work, which he is saying is a massive shock to the system. Well, I can tell you, it's quite a big shock to this system too. So now my working day finishes at about 3:30, when the kids get home from school, because although I'm not doing a school run, as any parent of teenagers will know, the whole emotional need thing is, it can be quite intense, and actually is more intense sometimes than the practicalities of, needing PE kits and shoelaces tied. And so I find I can't actually write once they're home.
Right. Well, that's a good segue to motherhood, because one of the things, and I also, I know you have 3 children, right? I believe. And and are they all teenagers? Are they close together?
Yeah, I had they're all within 15 months. So I've got a 15-year-old and then 14-year-old twins.
Oh, Claire, you crazy lady.
It was not deliberate, Danielle. What kind of fool do you think I am?
Oh, I know. The twins thing, it's what a shock to the system. Well, I mean, that is another thing I noticed about your books, which I love, because I think, and I also have a very involved, husband, and he's fabulous and he's very great with the kids, but there is something about being the mother, and there's so many wonderful mother-daughter relationships in the book, and actually in all your books. Well, not so much mother-daughter, I guess, in the 2 that I'd read before, but sort of, being a mother has such an impact on these characters. And I think I love that. It was so clear to me that there is so much angst, in your moving through your brain, not necessarily about your own mothering, but about what it is to be a mother. These women, we fret about our children, and the main character, the Welsh detective Fionn, who's fabulous. From the very moment we meet her, I just think I'm so glad she's going to be a series character, because she is somebody I want to read a lot about. But anyway, she's separated, moves back home, and she's a grown woman whose mother still treats her like a child, because that's what we do to our children. So talk about, like, your own experience, and you've got wonderful teenage characters, so it's obvious that you've got lots to draw on from home. Although I'm sure your children are angels in comparison to these, but it seems like an important theme to you, right? The motherhood.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it's not something I set out to write about, really, and yet it is glaringly obvious that motherhood is in every single one of my books, like front and center. And occasionally I kind of, expand a bit after the end, which is a non-crime book, is very much about parenting. It's a family drama. But yeah, motherhood, I think it's endlessly fascinated. I'm fascinated, for example, by things like when you get married, or when you're sort of happily in a relationship with someone, they are the most important person in your life. And when you have children, hopefully you don't stop loving the person that you've made this child with, but you love the child more.
Right.
And so that shift in dynamics is really interesting, because you go from a point where, you would do anything to save your loved one, to kind of being, well, I would, but actually, if I had to choose between the 2 of you, like, it would probably be the kid. And that shifts in an instant, in a heartbeat. So I love thinking about that, and how that, might relate to a novel. And yeah, what you say about how Fion's mum treats her is so true. Fion's grown up in this very, very tight-knit small community where everyone knows everyone, and they've known each other since they were born, basically. And small towns are really interesting, because everyone I meet from a small town is sort of conflicted. On the one hand, they love the fact that everyone knows them, and on the other hand, they can't wait to get away, and they find it really claustrophobic. So she's really sort of torn, and can't quite throw off the shackles of who she was as a teenager. Everyone still calls her Fionn Wicht, which means wild Fionn. And she sort of regresses a bit when she's with her mum. She behaves a bit like a teenager again, which I definitely do. You know what I
Me
do when I'm
too.
mum's house? So in my house, I will berate my teenagers for leaving mugs, cups all over the house. I'll have a cup of tea in my mum's house. I will leave my cup on the side. It's awful. It's like this weird regression. So yeah, motherhood endlessly fascinating, and I can't see me stopping anytime soon. I lost a child, so we're recording this in October. In the UK here, it's Baby Loss Awareness Week.
Oh,
So I had 2 sets of twins in 15 months. So the first set, they were born very premature, and when the boys were 5 weeks old, one of them contracted meningitis and died. And so my
okay.
parenting experience has been complex from the start. So it has been mired in grief that was then complicated by a surprise second twin pregnancy, all the sort of postnatal depression that you can imagine was a factor when all this was going on. And so a really, really complex start to
Yes.
parenting. And although, this is what would it be? It'll be 16 years ago. It's nevertheless, I think it made me examine the way I felt about parenting, the way I felt about children, the how fragile that
Yeah.
relationship can be, how lucky we are, and yet how we can also be grateful and lucky and fortunate, but also be terribly depressed or grieving
Of
or
course.
angry, or there's so
Right.
many complex emotions, and all of that ends up kind of finding its way into my writing somehow.
Which is, I mean, I think as a writer and a mother and and a reader, reading about you mentioned your loss, and I'm so sorry in your acknowledgments of let you go. And I thought, it's so powerful that we share these stories, because I think, you know, it's like you said, there's so much to be grateful for. And it's not to say we're not grateful for all the things we have, because we are obviously incredibly privileged. It doesn't take away for sure the grief of something like what you've gone through, but even the just hard stuff day to day, right, of being a mother. And I think by sharing sort of those, acknowledging, giving space to the idea that this is a hard job, even
Yeah.
for the luckiest of us. I think it's really I think it's something that can help all women, all mothers, and I think it's a gift that we can give people. So I love the fact that your mothers aren't like, they're not on the Oprah stage saying, "I stay at home, it's perfect, everything's great," because I think that's not always realistic.
No, it's not. And you're right. We have to have these difficult conversations, and to prompt these difficult conversations. And that is what we as writers, I kind of think that's our job,
Yeah.
to create these discussion starters, which might be about motherhood, might be about, dilemmas, about morals, about,
Yes.
all sorts of things. Our job is, of course, to entertain, but also to hold up a mirror to society and challenge the people looking into it.
Absolutely. And one of the things I love that also, just sticking on motherhood for a second, that is sort of to that point, is the idea that, you raise a child, but largely you have so little. I mean, you have some obvious control over sort of the way in which they grow up and the morals that you teach them, but you also have less control than you think you might. One, just by their nature. I always thought my children would be like me or my husband, but those are the choices. And yet neither of them is really like either of us. So there's this, you're raising a stranger to some degree, right? And the question is how little we can control, and how scary that is, that we can't dictate how they turn out.
Oh yeah, totally. And then if we were to explore that further and think about how we hold parents responsible for their children's behavior, from
Right.
when they're little, I blame the parents. And then, what happens if a child, a young adult, does something truly horrific? If they kill someone, if they set
Right.
fire to a house, how responsible is the parent for that? And how does that parent feel? And are they going to
Right.
carry guilt for that? I mean, it's such a fascinating subject, and that makes it such rich territory for us writers.
Especially for thriller writers, right? And then, and as you said, like sort of holding the mirror up to society. There's another theme in the book which I really love is the idea of redemption. Is this, Reese Lloyd, who is the victim in this book, is who has done some really, awful things. A number of people in the book have done some kind of not great things, but particularly, of course, our victim. And there's this process that even he goes through in the course of the book, which I find really interesting about, where he might be seeing some of the damage he's done, and is he redeemable? And the question is, do they deserve a second chance? Do they deserve a third chance? At what point do we consider people sort of irredeemable?
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? I'm a big believer in second chances and in restorative justice, where you're bringing victims and offenders together, and enabling offenders to confront the implications of their actions, the consequences of their actions. I think that can really work. I think there are sometimes, maybe quite a lot, of people who blow that second chance and that third chance,
Yes.
fourth chance. But then equally, I don't think we do a great job in either of our countries, actually, of rehabilitation. I don't think there is enough of a focus on actually trying to understand why things have happened. And
Right.
if you just look at the socioeconomic background of most of our inmates in prisons,
Hmm.
it's fairly clear, actually, that if we addressed the problems around poverty, around racism, around sexism,
Education. Yep.
education, that actually we would be reducing our crime rate significantly.
So true. It's so true. Yeah, and I love that. I think as writers too, we're students of this. It's the human nature, it's the system. We have to look at all these things, and you do a beautiful job of exploring that. I have a strange habit of reading the acknowledgments of a book before I start the book. I'm not sure where that comes from, but I always like to see who the author thanks. And one of the people you thank at the end of the last party is Lisa Jewell, and you mentioned that it's a conversation about her advice on research that changed your writing process. And of course, I'm like, well, I have to hear about that. Can you share that? We need to
Yeah,
know.
I can. I mean, I'm letting you into the cone of secrecy here,
So grateful.
circle of trust. So I was reading a Lisa Jewell book years ago, really, now, and there was a tiny point about one of her police officers that wasn't quite right, and I dropped her a line, and I know Lisa sort of relatively well. And I said, absolutely loved it. Definitely, going to give you a quote if you want one, for, really brilliant book. It's obviously still at the advanced copy stage. So, I if you want, I can tell you this minor correction about, how the police operate. And she went, "No, you're good. It's fine." And I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." And she said, I never do research. I'm a storyteller. I make things up. That's what I do. And I don't know what it was about how she, I mean, obviously, she's phenomenally successful. It
Yes.
works for her. And I just suddenly thought, how liberating, how
Ah,
freeing to not be obsessing over, does the number 63 bus actually go from that road to that road?
right.
Does it matter yes, there might be 2 or 3 people who happen to do that specific job in that specific way and know that specific fact. But actually, we are storytellers. Our job is to create an atmosphere of authenticity where the reader feels as though everything we're telling them is true. It doesn't actually have to be true.
God, I love that. That is so funny. I think Harlan Coben says something similar, that he just flies by the seat of his pants. Well, that is refreshingly lovely. I also I have gotten those, emails where it's like the highway is actually, it moves north south, but they consider it, we refer to it as east west. And I'm like, okay, that's really helpful, I guess, for, uh, future reference if I ever refer to that one little highway again, which I probably won't.
My favorite reader feedback, and quite genuinely I do love this, is so in Let Me Lie there are 2 characters playing a game of Scrabble. Do you play Scrabble in the States?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
So there's 2 characters playing Scrabble, and I have put the word score in of their particular go. Like, this is obviously not remotely relevant to the plot. It's just a thing that they're doing of an evening. And a lovely reader wrote to me to point out that I'd actually missed off the fact that it would have had to have crossed either a double word score or a triple word score. And so actually the word count was wrong, which meant that the other person had won the game. It's like, okay.
That is somebody with some seriously spare time, because they had to have set up the board, don't you think?
Or just like, I don't know a lot about Scrabble. But what I love about it, and actually what I love about all these readers who write to us with these really specific points, is like, kudos for reading our books in so much detail that you're noticing things like that, and you're thinking about them, and you're passionate enough about the stories that we've written to write to us to tell us. So, thank you.
That is
to all
actually,
those people.
That is so true. And I literally just got one the other day about, I have a character who cracks her knuckles, and she doesn't do it as much in the second book of the series. She's not she's not a major character in the second book, but it's funny. This person was like, did she just stop cracking her knuckles? Because she only does it like twice in the book, versus in the first book, she does it sort of much more regularly. And I thought, oh no, I don't think she stopped. But it's that is where my series Bible has let me down, because I didn't do a good job of, because you have to keep track, and it's fair. And
okay, so here is where I need to learn from you, right? So I am only on the 6th book of the series, and I have struggled because suddenly I can't make stuff up, because you've set things up in the first book. What are the things that I should be thinking about looking out for?
Well, like her car, right? Like her Triumph is a very specific car, Fion's car, and you can't change the color of it or how poorly it runs unless she gets to the mechanic. I mean, I think the layout of the town, and Glynis living above that. I mean, some things are going to change, but the heart, like that's the thing. I think a good series Bible, and actually, you probably have somebody who's a super fan. You could just put it out in the world, like, hey, if somebody wants to be a super fan and make a Bible of The Last Party, I'll send you a signed copy of the next book, because people love that. And I know Lisa Reagan.
Oh my God, that's genius.
She has, and you have obviously a ton of very devoted readers. So say, hey, I got a challenge, and you'll get 5 of them and put them together, Claire, and you'll have a series Bible.
I love that.
And it'll be better than the one we could create, because here's the thing: we know these stories too well that we gloss over things, that somebody else would notice. And so, and like her sister, and the red hair and the curls, and there's a lot of things you just have to,
So do you have like a written series Bible then?
It's just a Word document, which also you want, because you need to be able to search it, right? If I'm looking for the color of her eyes because I've lost my mind and I can't remember, then you just search, But yeah, I have a Word document, and clearly, cracking knuckles wasn't in it, and it's in it now.
Is it now? Right, brilliant.
It's in it now. It's in it now. So speaking of your super fans, you have a book club. There's a Clare Mackintosh book club. Is that a real thing, and how do we join?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's not Reese, it's not Oprah. It is just Clare Mackintosh. But the way this started was I hated sending an author newsletter. I really hated it. I hated being like me. I write one book a year.
Right.
I didn't like it. And but I did like the replies that I got from readers. And what I loved most is when they told me what they were reading. And sometimes I would say what I was reading, and sometimes people had read that too. And I thought, well, that's the bit I want to keep. And so about 4 years ago, I got rid of the author newsletter and I set up a book club, which now has about 20,000 people on the mailing list.
I love that.
A really, really active Facebook group with about 9,000 people in. And we talk about books, obviously, all the time. And then I pick a paperback every month and we have a sort of a guided read with questions at the end of the month, if people want to join in. And it's lovely. It's really lovely. And it's taken all that sort of feeling of ego out.
Yes.
So of course I still talk about my books. Of course I do. And of course, when it's that time of the year, I am, of course, going to say, please buy my book.
Right.
But actually, most of the time, it's about other people's books. And I'm much more comfortable that way.
I feel that way exactly, which is why I do this podcast. I'm a writer, but I obviously only write a book a year as well. But I read all the time. And I love, I'm such an avid reader. In fact, if I could retire, maybe I would just read. I have to think about that, how that would work. But no, I don't think we could stop writing probably, but that's fabulous. Okay. So it's on Facebook, or they can go to your website.
Yeah, they can go to claremackintosh.com and there'll be a pop-up that where they can sign up. But it's very easy to find just by Googling Clare Mackintosh Book Club.
And Clare Mackintosh, ClareMackintosh. Just in case somebody wants to spell. My daughter is also Claire. I love that name, but hers is the French spelling with the I. So yours is the English spelling. So tell us, Claire, what is next? Well, we sort of know. It's another Fionn story. Can you share anything about it?
I can. This will be the first time that I've talked about it.
Yes.
Which means that there is no sort of carefully honed pitch. So Fionn, we're back with Fionn and Leo, her English counterpart. And they have been summoned to investigate something. I don't think I'm going to say what it is yet because I haven't worked out everything. They will be spending their time in the mountains this time. So the last party is all about the lake. The next book, as yet untitled, that's not what it's called, is in the mountains above the lake, where a reality TV show is being filmed. The contestants on this show think that they have auditioned and been selected for a survival reality TV show, but they haven't. This show called Exposure isn't about survival. It's about how far would you go to protect your darkest secret from being exposed by the TV company, by the other contestants. So the crime that happens is within the backdrop of that reality TV show.
That is so fun, Claire. Well, I have to tell you, Leo, I'm so happy Leo's coming back. So, because I think in the back of the book, you tell us that you were writing the second Fionn book, but I wasn't sure what was going to happen with Leo. So, and what those two together. Okay. But, so this is out now. Is it already out in the UK?
It is. Yeah. It came out in August, went straight into the Sunday Times top 10, which is great. So I'm excited now for readers in the US and Canada to be able to read it.
Oh my gosh, such a fun book. And we can't wait for the next Fionn Morgan book. Check Clare Mackintosh out. You are at claremackintosh.com, which we already went through. And then you're also on Instagram with an...
I'm on Instagram as Clare Mac Writes. I'm on Twitter as Clare Mackintosh. And much to my teenagers' horror, I am on TikTok too.
I love it. I know, exactly. All of our teenagers are horrified by that. But you know what? Hey, they should give us some tips and then we'd be better at it. This has been so much fun, Claire. I am such a super fan. Like I said, I read, I just devoured. I had a Clare Mackintosh 10 days where I just devoured all these books. And I love getting to know you, and your books are amazing. And I'm sorry you have to write them twice, but all I can say is I think it might be worth it.
Oh, I love you for that. Thank you. That was such fun.
So fun. Hey, everyone, thank you so much for joining the Killer Women podcast with my guest, Clare Mackintosh. We will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.